So this is our program for the week of November 1st, 2024. This Tuesday, just the day before Francesca Albanese's scheduled briefings on Palestine at the UN, U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield posted this message on social media smearing Albanese as an anti-Semite. This isn't the first time officials within the Biden administration have parroted Israel's attacks against the Special Rapporteur on Palestine. We heard the same thing from Matt Miller in March and from various officials over the course of the year. In her interview with Democracy Now! This week, Albanese characterized Thomas Greenfield's comments as embarrassing for a senior official and smacking of desperation. In fact, Albanese was set to brief Congress this week, but that visit was canceled amidst a renewed set of personal attacks against her. She's been steadfast and clear in her assessment of the genocide, refusing to decontextualize the events of October 7th, and insisting that the frameworks of genocide and settler colonial violence are apropos. In her most recent report to the UN, Genocide as Colonial Erasure, it represents one of the most important accountings of Israel's genocidal actions against the Palestinian people and serves as a clear mandate for UN member states to intervene immediately and at every possible juncture to stop Israeli war crimes. So let's take a listen, at an extended listen, at some of her remarks that you may have heard or seen on social media, responding to questions on her report from the General Assembly this week.
And it comes at the end of 1 year during which Israel has attacked with its weapons UN premises. It has damaged and even destroyed some of the 70% of UNRWA premises. It has attacked UN peacekeepers. It has killed over 230 UN staff members. It has vilified and defamed officials of the United Nations, the Secretary General, independent experts, and the General Assembly itself. I think that this marks a point of non-return. I understand the need to preserve the integrity and the unity or the collegiality of this body. But what Israel has done this year alone, put aside the Palestinians, it's untenable. It's against everything this organization stands for and represents. And this is why I recommended that you consider suspending Israel from its membership to the UN until and unless it complies, at least with basic principles like ending the genocide. You call it ceasefire, I call it ending the genocide. Ending the occupation and working with this organization to end apartheid. To the question raised by the distinguished representative of Malaysia, what are the challenges that I face? Many. But I want to bring the attention to the challenges that face the Palestinians who are being slaughtered day in and day out, through and through. And frankly, I'm shocked. I always experience a sense of shock and delusion when I come to this room, because many of you recited the same script that you had in front of yourself last year. Of course we condemn Hamas attack. Of course we express solidarity with the Israeli victims. Of course we demand the release of the hostages, both the Israelis and the Palestinians. But is it possible that after 42,000 people killed, you cannot empathize with the Palestinians? Those of you who have not uttered a word about what is happening in Gaza, demonstrate that empathy has evaporated from this room. And empathy is the glue that makes us stand united as humanity. But don't worry, you can continue and you will become more and more irrelevant to the rest of the world, which is in turmoil. And it's not just the global south. Look at the young people in Europe, in Western countries, those to whom many of you, including my own country and Germany and France and the UK, are demonstrating that human rights are good to be taught in schools and universities. But don't dare you trying to exercise freedom of assembly and freedom of expressions in your street, all the more for Palestine, all the more touching our ally Israel. This is what you are telling young generations. I want to express my appreciation and gratitude to the countries on top of those who have already joined South Africa's proceedings in front of the ICJ, Belgium, Turkey, the Maldives, Ireland, Chile, and Spain, who have expressed their intention to join the proceedings. Please do that. Do that quickly, because justice is not the end of it, but is a step to put an end to the aberration that has been festering in Palestine and continues. And I cannot think that impunity, as I wrote in the report, impunity has not played a huge role in crystallizing the genocidal intent that has manifested and displayed this year. I'm really disappointed that 1 year into what I call genocide, and you are free to call the way you want, but you cannot leave the debate consumed and obscured behind technical and reductive reasoning, with a number of you not even mentioning the content of our report. This is not about charity toward the Palestinians. This is about your obligations, and your obligations include ensure the firm application of the Genocide Conventions to prevent the crime of genocide, to prevent, not to aid and assist in the commission of wrongful acts, not to cooperate and try to bring an end to serious breaches of international law, not to recognize as lawful a situation created by serious breaches of international law. And therefore, today, if you really want to comply with international law, there is no other ways than imposing sanctions to Israel, reviewing the diplomatic, economic, political, military, and strategic ties you have with this. And may this be the last genocide in human history.
Samar, it's great to have you back. Clearly Albanese is expressing a lot of exasperation with her UN colleagues, and at a level that maybe feels like something we can all empathize with. She's been a stalwart through this whole process and has really held the line even before October 7th, and been subject to these smears by the Israeli Hasbara, and also obviously by the U.S., which has taken up the cause at the highest levels. There are three things that she says there that I think are worth noting, and then as you get into your analysis, I'd love to get your thoughts on them. But she starts off by talking about this idea, or advancing this idea of the possibility of suspending Israel's UN membership. That's one. I think that seems noteworthy. I don't know if she said that before, at least not at a General Assembly meeting. And then the second is, the imploring folks to join the ICJ case, other member states to join the ICJ case, and obviously giving props to Ireland, South Africa, and everyone else that has already done so. And then the third was just a bit of a reprimand, right? That you can characterize this, as she thinks inaccurately, as a war, but under all circumstances that the member states have legal obligations that have been triggered and are triggered and activated by the admissions in her report, or submissions in her report rather. So a pretty she did a couple of briefings this week. She obviously did the interview on Democracy Now! I thought all of them were full-throated, and she always is, right? We love Francesca Albanese's, here. I mean, not to trivialize it and to being stands for her, but I think she's really held the line in a really remarkable way, while continuing to serve in her role. Yeah, what do you make of it? And then, how does this relate to some of what you're going to end up talking with us about at the start of our program today?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. It's definitely in there, so we'll get to the, I don't know, slide 12 or whatever it is. But yeah, I mean, I think it's worth taking a moment to really commend the way that I feel like Albanese handles a lot of this stuff, which I think is done with a lot of integrity, right? And she's very clear about not centering herself in that discourse, which I think is really important, and using her positionality to really try to build up the sort of international consensus about Israel's pariah statehood. And I think all three of those main points are sort of leading in that direction. And given that sort of like sense of international obligations and the way that they're not being fulfilled, mostly by the United States, although obviously to some lesser extent, a few European countries. You're now at a point where like a literal quasi-fascist government in Italy is like, okay, well, this is breaking too many of our policies. We have to do an arms embargo. So the fact that, we're just dealing with these like straggling few countries bolstered by the United States' ability to sort of, set the entire course of action is just infuriating and unsurprising, how their backlash against her is, right? Specifically because I think they're recognizing that threat, of their attempt to sort of like distort the entire international legal system, to benefit their little colony.
Yeah,
So,
and I mean, I don't know how often it is that any rapporteur, let alone any UN briefing, includes the reporter sort of challenging the member states on the possibility of their lack of legitimacy and irrelevance, right, if they don't act.
yeah.
And so, there's some bravery there. I mean, again, she's like you said, I think you're right. She's been very principled throughout the process, and steadfast. And even the framing of this report is seems unique, so I think it's called genocide as colonial erasure, which
Mm,
again, not something that I think we would expect from a UN report,
yeah.
and you of all folks, having worked in the international community, know that that's not the tone and tenor of most of those reports. But again, great to have you. Thanks for getting us filled in, and yeah, looking forward to hearing your updates.
Um, so jumping right in, as always, I like to start with the updated death counts. There's a lot to, I think, reflect on here about the accuracy of these counts and like how they continue to be sort of understated, just given the fact that the official death count in Gaza went up by about 150 this week. And two incidents that I'll cover in some future slides cover a higher number of deaths than that entire total. So like, I think it really speaks to the extent to which we're really not fully capturing, the scope of the violence and the scope of the death that's happening in Gaza. And I'm sure something similar is happening in Lebanon to a lesser degree, where the official death toll went up by about 400, but there is, of course, like a more functioning state apparatus to track that. One thing on the casualty count that I did want to flag from this week is just this report, that was put out a few days ago by AOAV, Action on Armed Violence, which I think did a really incredible job of breaking down some Israeli propaganda about, the number of like Hamas militants that are ostensibly within that 40,000, um, the death number, where they break out a group of civilian demographics that like they break out age groups and genders and identify that they're not just making the assumption that, women and people under 14 are non-combatants. They've actually looked at past historical, um, casualty like demographic information from Israel's previous assaults on Gaza and have shown that like no one affiliated with militant groups, fell into any of those categories. So that immediately cuts it by half. And then through some math that I probably won't get into today unless folks want to ask questions about it, uh, sort of estimated from that remaining group of middle-aged men, older boys, young men, how many of them, statistically speaking, based on past conflicts, are likely to be militant or like associated with sort of, armed resistance in some way. Uh, and the estimate that they come out with is that the civilian proportion of that 40,000 person death toll is at the most conservative estimate 75% and very likely something closer to 90%. And this is the 40,000 number of like specific identified people. So when you consider the folks trapped under rubble who are starved, whatever, those numbers are obviously almost entirely civilians, if not entirely civilians. So, uh, that piece of Israeli propaganda just right out the window, though I'm sure folks, on this call won't be surprised by that. So per usual, I wanted to sort of go through Palestine, starting in the south and working our way north to see some developments happening, locally. So, starting in Rafah on the Egyptian border, there were two remarkable press statements made by the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. One about how the military pressure in Rafah and across Gaza is working. He said it's creating conditions to free hostages. And another where a similar set of statements were made, but also noting that, painful compromises will be needed to bring the hostages home and that there are limits to what the military can achieve. So this sort of like contradictory set of statements where not only doing this sort of third round, for those of us who have been attending the PSAs know, the third round of mission accomplished flag waving in Rafah, and the third round of saying like, okay, yeah, Hamas military capabilities have been dismantled. Um, but now like layering in this perspective of, okay, we need to consider that at some point we have to make painful compromises, which obviously is an allusion to a ceasefire, right? Some sort of negotiated settlement. And so it does, I think, raise a question about whether Gallant is trying to set the stage for a possible actual ceasefire arrangement here. My sort of gut reaction on this is no, and we'll come back to that in a minute for why. But I think even the IDF is sort of recognizing the limitations of this military ongoing campaign in Gaza and its inability to sort of restrain the like violent armed resistance that they're facing. The IDF losses in Gaza this week have been some of the heaviest that have occurred throughout this conflict. So yeah, the attrition rate here is probably factoring into it in ways that we'll come back around to. But moving north a little bit to Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah, another airstrike on a series of homes in Khan Yunis killed at least 38 people. A similar set of strikes in Deir al-Balah included these really harrowing scenes of a medic taking a dead body into the hospital and realizing it was his own mother. It was just a really horrific video that I would not recommend for the faint of heart, but just again like speaks to the level of horror and trauma and pure evil, right? That's being inflicted on Gaza on a daily basis. Uh, the real big news from Gaza, though, of course, is in the north, where this encirclement campaign of starvation, the so-called general's plan that we've been talking about for a few weeks now, continues to gather steam. So we're seeing the sort of dual military tactics of intense aerial bombardments that are resulting in mass casualties. This attack that happened in Beit Hanun, I think, was the highest casualty bombing in months, if I'm not mistaken. The death count was 109 as of a few days ago, and I think it's gone up since then. So on one side, these sort of like really intense aerial bombardments, but alongside that, this campaign of total siege and strangulation. So uh, the complete blocking of food, water, medicine, any basic supplies that are going into Jabalia or the areas around it. It's actually still not clear how many people are included in that encirclement. Reuters says it's 100,000. I've seen things on Al Jazeera that put that number closer to 400,000. But whatever that number is, it's definitely in the six figures, and that group of people is completely cut off from every single lifeline. So you're seeing a total collapse of humanitarian aid, assistance, mobilization, coordination, uh, in a way that we've been seeing across Gaza on some level, but there's always been, Mecca, for example, who we continue to fundraise for regularly, is still able to provide some limited humanitarian assistance throughout most of Gaza, but because of the encirclement of the north, right, there's basically no ability to bring anything in. And this is particularly salient in the context of this 30-day U.S. Threat to cut off all arms assistance if aid isn't let into Gaza, where, we're now, I believe, 2 weeks out from that 30-day deadline. And the U.S. continues to say that humanitarian assistance is not getting in. They're doing it, of course, in the usual sort of backward, passive voice way that our lovely smirky spokesperson from the State Department, Matt Miller, likes to do, where they're saying food and water and medicine aren't getting in, without explaining why they're not getting in, who's stopping it from getting in. But the U.S. has been calling it unacceptable. Whether that actually means anything and what that'll actually imply when this 30-day deadline ends, like I still don't have a lot of confidence that the US government will actually do anything to go through with that ultimatum, but it is going to put them in a really awkward situation given that by their own admission, no aid is coming in. So it's hard to imagine that changing in a meaningful way in the short term. So in the context of that, this sort of ongoing uh, starvation tactic and encirclement tactic in Jabalia, I wanted to highlight this article that I thought was quite compelling. This Raja Abdul Haq article in Middle East Eye about the so-called Jabalia doctrine, which I think points to a few important aspects of this that maybe are being underconsidered. One is the total collapse of what had been a sort of operating colonial model in Israel, particularly in terms of how the US wanted Israel to operate, which was this, good Palestinian, bad Palestinian binary model where you could uplift the good Palestinians who were willing to recognize Israel and, like didn't feel the need to advocate for an independent state, etc. While isolating the bad actors who are, the militants or the more radical folks or whatever. And obviously, I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone on this call that that model is basically dead, right? So there is no conception anymore of like separating militants out from the broader civilian population, for example, but rather the expectation that everybody is culpable and that collective punishment is the only way forward. But not only the collapse of that dichotomy is the thing that's raised in this article, but also how the manifestation of the policies that result from that, right? This sort of like widespread, oh yeah, well, I mean, 300,000 people, they're all culpable, is that Jabalia isn't like a sort of isolated plan for a single area, and this sort of siege tactic doesn't just exist in that one spot, but rather should be understood as a model of counterinsurgency that Israel not only hopes to replicate across Gaza, but also potentially in the West Bank, and could also be sort of seen as a counterinsurgency model for the US and other sort of colonial adventurers overseas. In the context of all this, though, I also just wanted to note the ongoing resistance, even in Jabalia, even in the absence of food and medicine, and the total besiegement of that area, where again, just this week, another 4 soldiers were killed by some IEDs. So, like, even that tactic, and even in its most extreme form, actually isn't a really effective means of stopping armed resistance, which again, when you think about it for a few minutes, is not surprising, right? The level of anger and animosity that this is all engendering is just, sending recruitment numbers through the roof. So these additional 4 dead IDF soldiers, I think now brings the total number of IDF soldiers killed in Gaza to over 600. It was hovering just below that last week, so I'm sure it just passed it this week. And that's like the number of killed is obviously a tiny fraction of the number injured, which I think is now in the 10, 12,000 or so, if I'm not mistaken. And so I don't want to spend too much time like reiterating sort of the horrors of this campaign of coordinated starvation. Obviously, the sort of scope and scale of it is unprecedented in modern history since World War II, but uh, I did want to highlight this New York Times op-ed by Michael Fechri about, Israel is weaponizing hunger against Palestinians. Here's how the U.S. can stop it. You will be extremely unsurprised to hear that the way that the U.S. can stop it is an arms embargo, right? And to stop like the impunity of Israel at the UN and other levels of the international system. So it's just good that this sort of stuff is getting more coverage and more mainstream press. But a key piece of that starvation strategy is, of course, the delegitimization and the like defunding of UNRWA, the main UN agency that has been supporting Palestinians since 1948. So this UN Refugee Works Association, which we've talked about many times on the PSA previously, as being a UN body that the Israeli state has been actively engaged in a campaign to undermine for decades now. It's like part of sort of ongoing Israeli policy, specifically around the idea that because it's a UN agency that supports Palestinian refugees, the whole concept of Palestinian refugees is an affront to like Israel's sense of its own territorial integrity. So uh, this sort of unavoidable and perhaps predictable endgame is now, upon us, where the Israeli Knesset has voted to ban UNRWA entirely from Israeli territory, which of course also means banning it from all the occupied territories. Uh, it's hard to overstate how big of a deal this is. We've talked a number of times about the importance of UNRWA in delivering humanitarian assistance for Palestinians. UNRWA does a lot more than humanitarian assistance. Incidentally, it's also schooling and a series of other things, but no other organization has anything close to the infrastructure that UNRWA has for delivering assistance. So it's sort of inconceivable to consider what the humanitarian coordination situation would look like without UNRWA, to the extent that even the United States at this point is condemning this decision, right, and urging Israel to reverse it. It's a bit rich, obviously, hearing that from the United States, given that the US played a critical role in defunding UNRWA based on those like early spurious Israeli accusations of like four, UNRWA employees somehow being associated with Hamas that were never proven, by the way, and the promised evidence actually never materialized. But nevertheless, here the US is defending the institution that they basically spent months attacking, and are prohibited from funding due to, whatever spending agreement that they reached with the Republicans a few months ago. Um, so zooming out from the sort of like specificities of the Israeli tactics here, I wanted to take a moment to look at how the world is responding to these really escalated attempts at genocide that have been taking place in the last few weeks in particular. The number of UN statements that have come out this week have been absolutely staggering, right? The UN human rights chief said the darkest moment of Gaza is unfolding now. The UN Humanitarian Coordination Office said the entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying. UNICEF said nowhere is safe. Basically, all of these institutions are ringing whatever highest level alarm bells are available, while not being able to materially move anything because of the United States. And in the context of all of that is, of course, also Francesca Albanese's new report update. This is like the follow-up for her Anatomy of a Genocide report that came out in March. We talked about it a little bit at the top, so I don't think we need to spend much time getting into it now, but just to say that, a key piece of this is her going into how, because of Israel's impunity in Gaza to sort of enact this genocide, it seems inevitable, and we're already seeing the beginnings of creating a similar dynamic in the West Bank, right? And she even, quotes a series of Israeli officials, including Yoav Gallant, who talk about, what we did in Gaza, we are going to do in Jerusalem, and, whatever. So uh, she calls it a tragedy foretold, right? Like everyone knew that this would be the direction that it goes, and because no one did anything to stop it, it's just a sort of inevitable escalation. So I did include the link to the report itself in the slides, so if folks want to read it, I do highly recommend it. It's riveting and meticulously researched and really quite powerful. I also wanted to note this Vox article that stunned me this week, where I don't know if folks remember this or saw it, but in the early months of the original Israeli assault on Gaza, like back in November, I think, Vox asked 5 genocide experts whether or not what was happening in Gaza was a genocide. Back then, only one of them said yes. It was Raz Siegel, the Israeli genocide scholar, who called it a textbook case of genocide. And the other 4 sort of gave like equivocating answers. And so Vox went back a year later and asked those same people, like, what's your take now? And all of them switched over, and basically every genocide scholar that Vox asked said, yes, actually, this is a genocide. And I put the 3 quotes of the 3 other scholars that they asked, and these are their like updated responses. The only person that Vox talked to that has not yet called this a genocide is what's his name? Something Waxman. I think it's Dov Waxman, who's the chair of Israel Studies at UCLA, and who said something along the lines of like, I can see why everyone thinks it's a genocide, but I don't think it is. So, but yeah, like the extent of consensus here, right? I think is getting to the point where it's really staggering. And then the last resource that I wanted to draw folks' attention to that came out this week on sort of understanding the scope and scale of this genocide is this new incredible report by Forensic Architecture about they call it a cartography of genocide, and it's a sort of like interactive tool that allows you to see the different ways that Israel has implemented the genocide in Gaza, from like displacement to bombardment um, to starvation, and it sort of like breaks all those out geographically in a really incredible way. And similarly, this article, Seven Perspectives on International Law and Palestinian Liberation, which includes a number of friends of the PSA, including Daryl Lee and Diala Shammas and Noura Harakat. All of these articles just incredible. I cannot recommend highly enough. You should read all seven of them. They're really quite powerful and different in really meaningful ways that I would have loved to get into, but time is time. So in the context of all of that, the ceasefire. It's a slide that I haven't had in the PSAs in like, I don't know, a month and a half now, maybe, because it has been sort of dead in the water. And now all of a sudden there's all these new articles about these potential new ceasefires. There's two different conversations that often get conflated. There's the ceasefire conversations that are happening about Gaza and the ceasefire conversations that are happening about Lebanon. So I'm going to talk about the Gaza ones now, and then we'll get to the Lebanon ones when we get to Lebanon. But just to say, Bill Burns has been back doing the rounds, talking to the Qataris and the Egyptians about a new potential ceasefire. Bill Burns really, at this point, basically functioning as an actual Secretary of State because Anthony Blinken so incapable of doing even the sort of basic job that he's supposed to be doing. It really does seem to be Bill Burns that runs the show here in terms of U.S. diplomacy overseas. And the plan for this ceasefire, as I understand it, this attempt to build momentum for a new agreement is a limited cessation of hostilities for a hostage exchange, right? So this isn't the permanent ceasefire that we've been talking about for quite some time. The US version floated by Burns, I think, is for a 1 month ceasefire in exchange for some limited hostage exchange. I think it's 40 people or something like that, or a dozen. There's some other offers on the table that are floating around, including, I think Egypt put one out for a 12-day ceasefire for 4 hostages. The idea is, all these different actors are trying to get some cessation of hostilities, some like limited pause in exchange for a small number of the hostages as like a potentially palatable first step. But as you can even see here, like the optimism on these ceasefire negotiations, I think, is a little bit overinflated. Like even in this headline from the Daily Sabah, Hamas open to new talks on Gaza ceasefire deal and Israeli withdrawal, right? Which has been the sort of standing line for Hamas since the beginning of these ceasefire negotiations, which is, yeah, we're open to a ceasefire and we're happy to sign one. It has to be predicated on a full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And I don't imagine that a 12-day ceasefire or a 1 month ceasefire would actually involve a withdrawal of troops. So it feels a little dead in the water. Bit hard to say because, Hamas's leadership structure is obviously a little bit unclear now with the death of Yahya Sinwar. So don't know. There could be a surprise, but I certainly wouldn't hold my breath. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, another 7 Israeli soldiers and some civilians actually killed in rocket attacks from Hezbollah. This has made that battlefront the deadliest that it has been, unsurprising now that the sort of Israeli ground offensive is in full swing. I think the total number of Israeli soldiers killed in October, at least confirmed, is something like 33, which is high, right? All things considered. But it's hard to really know the effect of all of that. Like, I've been trying to wrap my head around what's been happening in southern Lebanon so that I could give a better analysis today. And I got to tell you, like, it's hard, right? It's hard to really know the extent to which Israel is achieving its objectives versus getting its butt kicked in its attempts to like move in. One thing is very clear: the Israeli forces have not managed to move very far past the border. They're moving very, very very slowly, uh, particularly if you compare it to their invasion in 2006. But it's not clear how intentional that is, right? It might be a really slow move to sort of just completely degrade infrastructure in specific places, um, and to hold those because it knows that it can't move any faster than that, given the sort of stiff level of resistance. Um, in the meantime, they're being supported by the U.S. government, where the U.S. ambassador is um, supposedly, according to some of these leaks, telling people in Lebanon to launch an internal uprising against Hezbollah, which like long-running tactic, of Israel coordination with right-wing forces in Lebanon, who cooperated a lot during the Lebanese Civil War. But yeah, the leaning on the United States for the sort of like outcome of this process and the talk of a ceasefire now does seem to imply that uh, something similar is happening here as is happening in Gaza, where the Israeli military is saying like, "Oh yeah, look, we were accomplishing our objectives. We've done the things that we need to do. So like now it's time to work out a ceasefire." While rockets are still being fired, like the whole reason they said they were going in was to stop rocket fire in the north of Israel, but that's happening every single day. So it sounds like they're looking for an out. Whether or not they're looking for an out because they've done what they wanted to really do, it's not super clear. The level of destruction is obviously extremely, extremely high. They've completely demolished five, six, seven villages, where the area in southern Lebanon is basically uninhabitable. So maybe that is itself the plan. As for the ceasefire negotiation itself, there's been a lot of news lately saying that it's coming. I've seen several articles now that said days, if not hours. I'm a little skeptical of that, but again, I mean, I've been wrong many times. The sort of basis of this ceasefire negotiation was something that uh, Amos Hochstein is currently negotiating with the Lebanese government. If folks remember from a PSA from a few weeks ago, Amos Hochstein was the guy who was revealed by ProPublica Research to be the one who was actually encouraging the Israelis to accelerate their attacks. So I don't know, it's yeah, like the worst conceivable person to be negotiating this ceasefire, but here we are. The basis of it is, on its face sounds not unreasonable, right? It's basically the terms of the ceasefire are to return to the UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which is the one that ended Israel's invasion in 2006, which was never implemented. But the basis of that agreement was that Hezbollah troops withdraw north of the Litani River, and in exchange, Israel respects the sovereignty of Lebanon, right? So like no flights over Lebanon, no more bombings, assassinations, whatever. Neither party has done that, of course. And it seems that the basis of this negotiation, they're like, yeah, it's a, enforcing Resolution 1701, but Israel maintains the right to enforce it. So basically saying that like, no, Hezbollah has to do the things that were in that resolution, but we won't do any of ours. Like we'll continue to sort of fly over Lebanese airspace and like reserve the right to bomb targets that we consider to be a threat. So like hard to imagine that actually going through in that form. The new Secretary General of Lebanon has mentioned that they're open to a ceasefire, but that might be again a thing that's very similar to what's happening with Hamas, where like, yeah, they're open to it under appropriate uh, terms, and these are not those terms. But I don't know. It's clear that the Biden administration is pushing really hard to get a ceasefire done before the election. I think that's why we keep seeing days, if not hours, for both of these ceasefire negotiations. But as everything else the Biden administration has done with regards to reining in its erstwhile ally, doesn't seem very likely. So in the absence of like these ceasefires moving forward, there are a few articles about what appear to be Israel's plans for long-term occupation, which I think we need to consider as like the ceasefire stuff could just be a smokescreen for Israel to just maintain its occupation indefinitely. One on the left about Gaza and one on the right about Lebanon. So I'll leave folks to read those if they feel so inclined. On to Iran. It was great because I think last Friday I had mentioned that it looked like the Israeli response was going to be delayed, and then it happened like a few hours later. So just to know, just goes to show, as much as I try to understand what's going on, there's a lot that will continue to surprise me. It was also a really surprising response. I think a lot of us were expecting a much bigger, more violent, more deadly Israeli attack on Iran. And I think part of that was that I fell for the same thing that I feel like I'm constantly warning on these calls not to fall for, which is when a government like broadcasts the things that it's going to do very loudly, then it's probably not actually going to do those things. And sure enough, right, for all the talk about like, oh yeah, we're going to hit the nuclear sites and we're going to hit the energy infrastructure, they ended up like knocking out a couple of uh, air defense batteries and then some like missile production facilities and drone production facilities, I think, and that was it. An extremely restrained response, all things considered. They're talking about it as if they like dealt this horrible blow to Iran, but it seems very clear that it's a really, really limited strike that will, of course, impact Iran's ability to defend itself from future airstrikes, but like I don't think that meaningfully. Although, again, not super clear, hard to know. Some quick news on the ICJ, where South Africa has been promising for a while now to deliver a new batch of evidence, and it has done so as of this past Monday. A massive trove of documents that apparently is too big, and they're being asked to like hold some of it because the quantity of new evidence is just so overwhelming. Um, Meanwhile, a new case seems to be forming where Norway has asked the ICJ to weigh in on Israel banning UNRWA as being the sort of like violation of international humanitarian law. And not only UNRWA, but like also, the ways that it's put up obstacles for any UN agencies to do aid work. So good for Norway for actually like doing something about this UNRWA block instead of like the United States just saying that they're upset and then sitting on it. For the ICC, some weird stuff is going on. We're now 5 months out from Karim Khan's request for arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. Um, One judge on the panel has stepped down and been replaced under somewhat unclear circumstances. And then Karim Khan himself appears to be in the middle of the crosshairs of some sexual misconduct allegations. I wish I could tell you what to think about that, but on the one hand, like those sort of allegations are a common tactic used to delegitimize enemies of the United States. Consider like Julian Assange, for example. On the other hand, like, we've talked about Karim Khan on here a few times before. He's not a very good person, so I don't know. I wouldn't be super duper surprised. Um, On to the like some of the arms stuff that was revealed this week. A shocking, shocking revelation in the Middle East Monitor that uh, even I feel like I've gotten really jaded by what the State Department has been doing, particularly after those ProPublica articles that we talked about a few weeks back around the reports from USAID or whatever about how Israel is blocking humanitarian aid, and Blinken sitting on those reports and sort of lying about them. This is like a next level thing, which is the State Department, last August, I think, Biden put in place this new policy of requiring these reports anytime they find that US weapons have resulted in civilian harm. This was a policy specifically put in place for Biden to like reduce some of the pressure he was facing about arms transfers to Israel, if folks remember. And that process has been implemented and it's happening in the State Department. And there have been 500, like just shy of 500 of those reports that have been put out inside the State Department where they found, sometimes using public sources, sometimes using their own private intelligence, that, oh yeah, look, this US made bomb has like hurt civilians. And the way that that process is supposed to work is it goes through these like three stages of development. So like first they analyze what happened, then they like, do an assessment of the policy impact, and then there's supposed to be some sort of department action based on those assessments and that analysis. And that third step has never occurred, not once. So all 500 of those reports are stuck at either stages 1 and 2, and like senior leadership in the State Department won't move them forward. So just another layer of just total craven complicity in this genocide, and the total unwillingness to enforce like the US's own policies and laws around how they should be using these sort of like weapons transfers processes appropriately. And this in the context of uh, a new study from Brown University that showed that the US is bankrolling 70% of the cost of this war. So like it's really just sitting almost entirely on US arms transfers. And even in the context of that, there seems to be a total unwillingness to hold any accountability about what those arms are doing. Um, Near the end here, I just wanted to note incredible week of BDS victories across the board. Some really fascinating ones. Now that we're in the end of October, it's a turning of a fiscal quarter. So we saw the revenue statements of a lot of these big multinational corporations, and we saw that Starbucks and McDonald's, two of the main sort of boycott targets from this war, have suffered their biggest sales slump since the start of the pandemic. Really remarkable. Uh, Analysts do attribute some chunk of that to the boycott. I would say probably a lot of it to the boycott. A number of authors, including Sally Rooney and Arundhati Roy, are calling for a total boycott of Israeli cultural institutions. The airport in Tel Aviv has shut down one of its terminals because tourist traffic to Israel has gone down so much this year. And then my personal favorite, Barclays, a bank that was heavily invested in the Israeli weapons company Elbit Systems, has divested from Elbit Weapons as a result of a ongoing, really coordinated campaign by Palestine Action targeting Barclays specifically. And I think Palestine Action made it very clear from the very beginning, we're going to make it more expensive for Barclays to keep these investments than it would be for them to lose the investments. And that's exactly what they did. And it seems to have worked. And I think it's a really powerful example of understanding how to assess and impact the material conditions that underlie the complicity in this genocide, right? As opposed to like appealing to people to do the right thing. They really hit them where it counts, and it worked. Yeah, you love to see it. And so Palestine Action has called off their campaign on Barclays, right? Because they won. I wanted to close with some reflections on the election. There was this Intercept article this week revealing the extent of AIPAC's power in Congress, the scale of candidates that they're supporting, and the effectiveness of those endorsements in terms of the money that goes into those campaigns and the way that they impact outcomes. You can see this chart on the top right here that shows every AIPAC-backed candidate. And you can see on the left the Democrats, on the right the Republicans. So they've backed like 100 some odd Democrats and 200 some odd Republicans, and all but 4 have won. And then they go into some of the resources that AIPAC has put into both like AIPAC directly and its sort of like associated organizations have put into campaigns to defeat progressive Democrats, particularly squad members like Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman. And the staggering level of money that's poured into both like advertisements supporting their preferred candidate and attacking the person that they want out. It's important to remember that AIPAC started doing this 2 years ago, right? Like we think of AIPAC as this like long-running sort of malignant force inside Washington, D.C., and that's true, but directly involving themselves in congressional races was a thing that they started in 2022. So the scale with which they've ramped up to be this level of effective, I think not only is a really worrying sign, but also I think should cause us to reflect for a little bit about why AIPAC considers it a priority and a necessity to engage in this, right? Like their concern about the loss of electoral relevance and their need to pump millions and millions of dollars into these races should say something about our responsibility to contest that terrain and not like cede it directly to AIPAC. And in the context of all of that, here we are, 5 days from the election, where I wanted to highlight like maybe a ray of hope and a dark cloud. on every perspective here. So there is, the Democrats, where Bernie Sanders has pledged that a Kamala Harris presidency would be a transformative shift in U.S. policy towards Israel, clearly trying to appeal to a very large base of disaffected voters who are refusing to vote for her. And then like a day later, Bill Clinton goes to Michigan and says some nonsense about human shields and talks about Judea and Samaria and, like Israelis were there first and a bunch of nonsense in Michigan. Um, there's a lot to say about whether Bill Clinton did this on purpose or not. But that's maybe a conversation Thomas and I can have later. On the Republican side, it seems like Trump is putting pressure on Netanyahu to stop the war because even Trump recognizes how bad it would be for him. But at the same time, a series of articles has come out in the past week or so about Project Esther, which is like the Project 2025 corollary about undermining the so-called Hamas support network, this like group of organizations, these like anti-war, anti-militant groups that, uh, according to the Heritage Foundation, basically need to be dismantled and prosecuted. That incidentally includes us, Iraq, and a series of other allied organizations, including like JVP and others. So it's a terrifying document. You should read it. It's very scary. Lastly, I just wanted to point you to a few articles that I think were particularly valuable for me as I reflected on where we're at in this election and what it all means. There's this great Max Elbaum article from a couple of weeks ago, but a podcast interview about it just a few days ago that I would definitely recommend people give a listen to about the margin of effort and what that means in terms of like how we put our time and how long this protracted struggle is going to take to build the sort of internationalist uh, politic that we're trying to build and how that requires this sort of like multi-pronged approach. Also, this sort of what I found to be a fascinating sort of dichotomy of perspectives on what to do in this moment and how we as a movement relate to the Harris campaign. Uh, these are two very different perspectives, and I actually found a lot of value in both of them. On the left, the dumpster fire picture is the Sunrise Movement explaining why they're going to continue to vote for Harris in the context of this genocide. And on the right, Noor Alakat on why she's not voting for Harris in the context of this genocide. So I would definitely encourage folks to give both of those things a listen and see where you land on it. Although most of the folks listening here are in California and our vote on this doesn't matter anyway. And so just to sum up, the I actually left my bullet point from last week unchanged on the Jabalia thing because it's the same. The horrors in Jabalia may be the worst we've seen yet, and as norms continue to erode, things will get worse, which has happened this week, and I think may well happen again next week. We don't really know if Israel is succeeding in Lebanon, but given the situation in Gaza, like, given that Hezbollah is like 10 times at the capacity of Hamas and Hamas is still operating with relative impunity in Gaza, it does feel unlikely, but we'll know more as these sort of so-called ceasefire negotiations move forward. The attack on Iran was surprisingly performative. It's interesting to think about whether or not the US actually applied pressure here for the first time ever because of Biden's concern about an attack before the election. A remarkable week for BDS. And then lastly, of course, the election is Tuesday. And I do want to remind folks who are feeling very disaffected about the national level candidates, the local level matters a lot. And AROC as a C3 can't talk about that in any detail on this call, but I, in some of my other hats, would be very happy to talk about some of that stuff with you. So maybe there will be opportunities to do so. The last upcoming action I just wanted to flag was this sign-on letter to get Butler and Padilla to join Bernie Sanders's joint resolutions of disapproval to block the arms sale to Israel. So would really encourage folks to sign that if they can. If people want to get involved in this campaign, I know the organizers are really looking for volunteers. So please do let us know when we can connect you with them. And to close, if you want to know what's going on, check out the AROC calendar for events that are happening in the Bay Area. If you want text updates, just text PSA to 833-633-0604. And check out the Palestine Media Tracker for the news and articles that inform this analysis. You can sign up at palmediatracker.com/signup. And that'll do it. Thank you all so much.
Um, yeah, and without further ado, just want to thank Sam or you again today for all the updates, and Annie for holding us down in the back. And we'll see everyone in a week's time. A lot will be transpiring between now and then, so stay connected and expect us to post some information on what we'll be doing to convene folks and mobilize in the days, weeks, and months ahead. Until then, free Palestine.